So the first thing I want to ask you is, would you tell me about your memories of Greece? And first, just your memories of Greece, and your mom and dad and what they did, your family.
Yeah. So, do you want me to answer that now, or?
Yeah, I want to just I want to start from the beginning, and I'm going to ask you about music along the way and different things. But I want to ask you about your life too. You know, about besides everything.
Well, if we're gonna visit about that, then I'll just start at the beginning. I think my earliest recollections go back to when I was possibly 4, 5, right in that range, because I don't know. It's hard to know exactly where these images in my head come from. You know, what date is it? Because time wasn't relevant. When you're a single digit and closer to 0 than a 10, you know, that's where I was. So I can remember being a skinny little pigeon-toed, funny-looking little boy, and being that young, still, you know, 3 or 4, I was placed in, you know, I looked like Gandhi with his bib around his, you know, butt. And, my mom had a diaper pinned around my ass, so I think that's probably what I was wearing, and nothing else in these images. But I was hanging around with 5 or 6 old ladies and some younger ones, and they were spinning wool and cackling like chickens in a hen house, talking and laughing, and they would ask me, you know, silly things, you know, just to make themselves laugh at what a child would say to when asked certain things. Anyway, I remember Salonika, my home city, back in Greece, and the broad streets with trolleys on them, and lots of Model T's, I think, or Model T's. I don't know, but it was the ones where you had to crank something in the front to get the damn thing started. Those were the cars that were operating Model T's and Model A's in Greece at that time. There were no modern cars. This would have been in 53, 54, 55. Okay. And these are the recollections that I have. I remember that my grandfather was a forest ranger for the government, and his territory was the mountains right above Thessaloniki, Salonika, the same. And he would, you know, be up there day and night on call, watching for fires and watching for thievery and brigands and things to that effect, making sure that, you know, he was the law, basically. And then my father, I remember him sitting down with his little bouzouki. They call him baglava. B-A-G-L-A, baglava. T-H-A, maybe. Okay. Anyway, it's a little Greek bouzouki. It's like a tenor bouzouki. The regular bouzoukis have real long necks. Well, this one's the same body style, but a real short neck, and it's got a higher pitch sound to it, and it's used differently than the long neck bouzouki. It gives a nice effect. Someday I'll sit down and reveal the differences between the instruments to you if we have some Greek music to listen to, and I'll dig some up.
I just looked it up. It's baglama, M-A-S.
Baglama. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, you're right. Anyway, he would sit there and play his little instrument, and he'd be singing the blues in Greek. Now, in Greece during that time, you got a different culture. Starting in the 20s, there were about 1 million Greeks or 2 million Greeks that were evicted out of Turkey and had to come back to Greece, and about 1 million Turks had to leave Greece to go back to Turkey. That was part of a treaty between the two nations after they fought a war. So you had this influx of roughly 1/3 of the population back in the 20s were these new upstarts they were Greeks, but nonetheless, but they were from a different part of the world, you know. And they lived where they lived since eternity. But they had to get out of there because of the different religions and different cultures between Greece and Turkey, one being Christian and one being Muslim. So the influence of the Asia Minor or the Occidental Greeks that came over from the Orient, they brought with them their culture from the Middle East, from Turkey, and which meant that they smoked hash in their hookahs. Their style of music was different than the mainlanders of Greece that weren't part of the exchange. And the other part that added to the whole situation was that there was no work for these 2 million new refugees that came over. So everybody was just holding on to something, anything they could hold on to survive. So everybody had the blues because without work, there's no money. Without money, there's no food. Without food, you're always hungry. With that in your stomach, you're always looking across the waters or somewhere else to find salvation. Anyway, my father and my mother's families both came from Turkey in the 20s. They both had large families, meaning 6 kids to 7 kids, of which 1 or 2 died along the way, leaving in my mom's family 6 out of 7, and in my dad's family 6 out of 7 or 8, who knows. My dad was the eldest in his clan. My mom was the eldest in her clan. During the early 50s, right out of war after war after war in Greece, the nation was set back time and time and time again. It went, from one battle to the next, and even if they were on the winning side, they got the worst of it because you had the Germans up till 45. You had, prior to them, the Italians evaded Greece, and it's the Germans that came in to save the Italians because they were getting their asses kicked. The Albanians and the Greeks never got along. It was the Albanians that let the Italians come and use their ports from which they could drive their spearhead into the mainland of Greece. It didn't go well for the Italians during that campaign, but still they had to be fought. So you fought Germans, you fought Italians, you fought Albanians. Before that, you had wars with the Serbs and the Bulgarians, because they're our neighbors to the north, and they were all grabbing at each other's nothingness in order to enrich themselves. They were all struggling to gain more territory from the other countries. So you had wars with Bulgarians, Yugoslavians, and then you had the wars with the Turks. I'm going backwards in time as opposed to starting when the actual conflict began, which was 1453, when the Turks invaded or put siege to Constantinople and took over the city in the spring of that year, in April and May. So since those days, 1453, there's been a Greek population in Turkey. The Turks allowed the Greeks to live in Turkey. They didn't massacre everybody. They let some of them live so that they could use them as people to do the farming and to collect food from, and to tax and to use as conscripts in wars, and to take the daughters from the Christians and put them into the harems of the Turks, that sort of shit. So that's when the conflict began. That's where the Greek populations that my grandparents on both sides came out of. That's where the 2 million left Turkey to come back into Greece during the 20s. And there's still a sizable population of Greece or Greeks in Turkey, but they didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay, and they're converts into Islam now. They might as well be just Turks, and that's what they are. So anyway, that element of the Greek population, the 2 million, brought with them the culture that they just been expelled out of, which was, like I said, honky-tonkin', which would be going to a tavern of sorts where you could buy a hookah for a half hour and get stoned. You know, they would provide the hash, and they would also have ouzo or wine, no beer, because beer, Greeks never got into beer, mostly ouzo and wine. Anyway, and hash. Those were the elements that made the blues happen in Greece.
So let me ask you real quick. Would this the migration that happened in the 20s? Mm-hmm. Would this have been Calliope's and your mom and dad's parents or grandparents that made that migration?
They both did.
So you're okay. So but your parents were either really young or not born when that happened, correct?
Yeah. In other words, my grandparents and great-grandparents were the ones that escaped out of Turkey in the 20s and made it back to Greece.
Okay.
They then had children, and my parents were that crop of kids that in the 1950s, they were, in the early 50s, they were in their early, late teens, meaning 18, 19, 20, or early 20s.
Okay, got you. I just wanted to put that family generational context on it. So you would go to and when you say you go to like I don't know if you would call it a hookah bar, or what would you call it? The place.
I would just tavern, and that's the way we call them in Greece, taverna. And they would, in your bigger cities and in your smaller cities too, there'd be hookers there, there'd be sailors there, there'd be tough guys there, there'd be thugs there, there'd be guys trying to find a job there, and they were just escaping in the hash and in the music from the troubles. By night, they would go there to escape. By day, they would go out and scavenge what they could out of what there was, So they were day laborers. They would bust their fucking balls just to get enough money to maybe eat a meal, or get drunk, or lose it to some hooker or something to that effect. But there is a style of music that came out of the 20s and lasted through the 50s and into the 60s in Greece called Rembatika.
Rembatika.
Yeah, Rembatika. Remetika. Rembatika. And that is music that came out of the Middle East and back into Greece. And the influences of the Middle East, there's no separating what came out of where. There's a long line of establishment there. The Greeks were established in the Middle East, in Turkey, all of Turkey, since, BC times, before Christ. 1500 BC, there were Greeks colonizing Turkey and as far as Marseille in France, and Italy, and the north coast of Africa, because they were trading with everybody and colonizing as they went. So those people way back then, 1500 years, they had their style of music. Well, another group of people comes and mingles with them, and they exchange everything from ideas of food to astronomy to music, and they incorporate these things they learned into their own cultures. And that's the way it's been in the Middle East for the last 5,000 years. So what you're hearing today as being Turkish music or Arabic music has its influences in the Byzantine world and in the classical world before it, and in the Roman world, which came out of classical Greece anyway. So you have this influence of the Middle Eastern music that comes back with these 2 million, and that is the rock and roll music of the culture of Greece during that time period, late 40s, all through the 50s. Everybody wanted to be that rebel, and everybody was that rebel, with, they were all tough guys. They were all James Dean and Elvis Presley. And the term for the guys was manga Manga.
And what besides did they have a certain look about them, or was that just that they were tough, rough around the edges, or?
The look, oddly enough, is pretty universal. When I went to Vietnam in '71 or '2, whatever it was, they had a similar look: a white shirt, clean white shirt, black trousers, and whatever shoes you could find.
Yeah.
And that was it. And clean cut with a little thin mustache, kind of like the Slim Whitman would have. And their hair was combed back like an Elvis pompadour thing.
Mm-hmm.
I've got pictures of my dad from that time period with his sunglasses on. You know, they were all just trying to be cool.
Well, let me ask you this: the blues that you grew up hearing your dad play on the little instrument, the was that of the Rembatika tradition? Is that the same thing? The blues you were talking about?
The Rembatika music is that's the Greek blues.
Okay, so let me ask you this about Rembatika and the Greek blues. How would you describe that to me musically?
Melodically, it is some of the prettiest melodies I've ever heard. And I have to say that I draw on a lot of the melody of the times, you know, and because the structure of their melodies made sense, but not only did it make sense, but it was beautiful. And when you got the bouzouki, the baglaman, the oud, the guitar, the piano, the bass, and the accordion, and the fiddle, then throw in clarinets, and you have your classic rock and roll orchestra, Hellenic orchestra.
And would there be a lot of minor keys? I'm just thinking, when you mention Middle Eastern music, would it be a lot of minor key kind of bass tunes?
Yes. But you would have to study it to understand what it's about. The greatest singer of Rembatika music was a cat named Kazantzidis.
Okay.
Then there was another songwriter singer named Tsitsanis. Then there were composers of that style of music, and you can still find their music on two albums that came out on United Artists label back in the early 60s, 61, 62, 63, right around there. The first album was an album called Never on Sunday. The composer of those melodies and songs was Mikos Hadzidzakis. And his second album, following the first one, was Dancing on Sunday. So if you find those two albums and listen to them, you will have a wonderful representation of what I'm talking about, of that music that came out of the coast of Turkey, modern day, and everywhere from Smyrna to Constantinople. It was just the music of that world. So if you want to look those up, Odie, you'll find them very entertaining.
Okay, I will. Let me ask you this. That's why I'm glad I'm getting all these spellings and different things on here. So, like, melodically, because you call it the blues, and I've got a question about this, but would you say that the melodies would have, like, the blues scale in them as far as, like, a flatted third or a flatted seven? Would you hear that kind of blues scale in those melodies? No?
I call them the Greek blues only in reference to where the blues came out of pain and suffering.
Okay.
And that's the reference that I'm connecting to.
Okay. The reason why I wanted to ask that is, and you were talking about Islam and the different cultures coming from all over the place, and somebody had played me the Islamic prayer from Africa that, predates blues, and it's basically, you can hear the blues coming from that, That's a whole other thing, I think. But I was just curious.
No, only in reference to the lifestyle that came with the music. Mm-hmm. Guys were getting fucked up on a nightly basis. Guys were living lives of pain and crime and murder and thievery, and women were being abused by men every chance you could abuse one. So what made it the blues was the suffering that the music came out of.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm looking up there's several ways to spell Rebetiko or Rembatika. How did you pronounce it, Kostas?
R-E-M, Rem, Rembatika.
Yes. Just saying that it's an urban popular song of the Greeks, especially the poorest from the late 19th century to the 50s. That's interesting.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So
that is the outside case.
Let me ask you this then.
Metros like New York and the New Jersey metro area.
Those were your musical influences.
Yeah.
As a child. Then
there was another element that came in to that whole thing. As a child growing up in Greece, on occasion, you would hear things like this. When I first heard the case on Come Rolling Along, it took me out of the it must have been memorable because I remember, where did that melody come from? In other words, I was always intrigued with music that I heard, even as a single-digit toddler. That's all I had to play with, that and my imagination. I had my underwear on. I had a pair of wooden clogs for my feet. I had no brothers or sisters. I was the first child in my family to be born of all the brothers and sisters, my mom's. My mom and dad were married in an arranged marriage. In other words, she was the eldest of the family. He was the eldest of his. So their parents said, we're going to hook you guys up. You are on your own. God bless you. The priest crowns them, and off they go into the world to find, a life. They never knew each other before they got married. And to suddenly find yourself in bed with your husband and not know who in the fuck he is must have been quite interesting. But it was forced on them. They lived with it, in my case, for 21 years. And then the differences between them were too great for them to continue the process. So they divorced at that time. Anyway.
So you had told me that Calliope had met a chaplain there in Greece that helped you guys get hooked up with the family in Montana.
Correct.
Can you tell me about leaving, the want to leave Greece and the vision and the process and all, just tell me about all that?
Yeah. So my mom, after she had me, she went and found a job. She was working at a cigarette factory, packaging up cigarettes. My dad was a plumber and a metal worker in a plumber metal worker shop where they would cut pipe and get, do things with that plumbing business. He was also a soldier from 46 or 47 through 49, and he was part of the defense of Greece against the communist invasion from 46 through 49. I asked him once how many guys he killed, and he said 6 or 7. He wasn't sure. I said, I'm proud of you. Anyway.
So when did they decide they wanted to get out, and why?
Well, in the early 50s, after I was born in 49, there was nothing for them. My grandmother took care of me while my grandfather was up on the mountain patrolling the mountains for the government. My dad was either a soldier or got out of the army and got a job as a metal worker, plumber. My mom went to work as a, rolling cigarettes or in a hospital, cleaning, as a cleaning woman in a hospital. Bella, what was the question again, Odie?
Well, the inspiration to get out and then the process of coming to America.
Well, the inspiration of getting out of Greece was if hunger and poverty can be your inspiration, then the whole nation was full of it. Mm-hmm. And we were lucky in the sense that all the children of Greece in big cities were, during the day, were being taken care of by government-run programs and government-run schools. You brought your kid to the school in the morning, and the school would give him breakfast or lunch, teach him, let them play, and be friends. At 5 or 6 at night, somebody would come and pick you up, mom or dad, or one of your aunts or your grandmother or somebody, and take you home. And so that's what I was part of that social plan put in effect through the Marshall Plan. And there was an American there. He may have been a chaplain, but I think he was some kind of a school administrator or a doctor or politician, some kind of a bureaucrat that was there to help that particular school in Salonika during the time that I was there. But this man became aware of who I was, and I swear to God, somehow or another, he took to me out of all these thousands of kids that were in school, and some of them were my age, some of them were 14, 15 years old at that time. So this would have been in 53, 54, 55, right around there. We left in December of 56. It was almost 1957 that we arrived in Glendive, Montana from Greece. But anyway, and I don't know his name. I should have, while Bob and Ida Seavey, the folks that sponsored us from Savage, Montana, this little town called Savage in northeastern Montana, next to Williston, North Dakota, is their next biggest town over there. Anyway, so while they were alive, I should have asked them, but I never did. It never came up while they were still here, and they were still here through the 90s.
So this administrator hooked y'all up with them, and they paid your way over.
Yeah, I mean, this fella would send me home. I remember during Christmas, he dressed up as Santa Claus, and he passed out gifts at the school to all the kids he had presents for. And he gave me a little package to take home. And then my mom in Greek and he in English, and maybe through interpreters, would converse and got to know each other. Anyway, they got to talking, and they had probably a dozen, if not more, conversations over the next year or so. Mom asked him if he could possibly help us to get out of Greece and would there be anybody in America? That's why I referred to in my speech as a place called America, you know, and went through that primitive thought, trying to talk like they would have talked. Anyway, he inquired back here. Somehow he got the name of, through the Congregational Church. The word came back to this little town in Montana called Savage, in this little community church with, you know, maybe 30 or 40 people, farmers from the area. This one family volunteered to bring this family of a mother, a father, a son, and the mother's sister, Tina, to the States at their expense. And so that's what happened. This fella connected that family to my family in Greece. Those four individuals, my mom, dad, myself, and my aunt. And it just happened, you know. These people were farmers. They raised corn and sugar beets and had some cattle, maybe 20 head of cattle. They milked their cows. They had their chickens. They had their farm. You know, it was a small little farm. And they were part of a community. There were two churches in Savage in 1956. One was the Congregational Church. The other was the Catholic Church. We were Orthodox. We went wherever our sponsors were going. They were going to the Congregational church. So that's how we got here. They invited us over here. They paid for our way. They became our sponsors. For 2 years, they took care of us. They provided jobs for my dad. He was a farmhand. Mom was stay-at-home, fix dinner, kind of, take care of the family from the home front. Me, I went to school at Savage, starting in the first grade. The first year that I was in school, I was basically just trying to learn English. So that winter from 56 through that spring, as long as school was still in session, I was learning school at the right age of 7. I was learning English. 2 years from the date that we arrived in 59, we, by the way the law system was written up back then, after 2 years, the immigrants could go to a new city. They figure your sponsor has taught you how to speak English the first 2 years, and you've had a job. They took care of you. Your sponsor did for 2 years, basically. Then, that's why I said in my speech, now it's time for you to go home and do your own cooking or something to that effect. You remember?
I do remember that. And let me ask you, did the sponsor family get any kind of...
No.
They did that because they were good people.
They were good, solid American Christian folk.
Yeah. Wow.
They blindly invited a family of 4 into their house, fed them, and housed them for 2 solid years, and then released them into the world.
So you guys lived in their home with them?
Yeah, we lived in the basement.
That is beautiful. Let me ask you this. How did you come across the ocean? Was it plane or boat?
It was plane. It was either it had 2 propellers on each wing. Mm-hmm. It was whatever those planes were back there. And I can't tell you if it was probably Pan Am. But we took the train from Salonika to Athens. We flew out of Athens. We landed in England. From England, we flew to New York. Got to New York in the middle of a blizzard. Had to fly out of New York. Couldn't land there, so we went to Newfoundland, parked there till the storm was over, flew back into New York. I have memories of me, my mom, and my dad holding his or her hand, or my aunt's, staring straight up into the sky, trying to find the end of these skyscrapers in downtown New York City.
Wow. How old were you?
I was 6.5.
Wow.
And this would have been December the 6th, 7th, right around there, of 1956, almost January 1st, New Year's. So, there we were, strangers in a strange land, in the middle of some night, staring at these silent streets, staring straight up, and watching snowflakes come down and not seeing the end of those buildings. And this was my first encounter with America, was in New York City, looking straight up. And just, I might as well have landed on the surface of some planet, because it was so alien, everything was.
Yeah.
So we were at the train station in New York City and looking around there waiting for our train. That's what that whole vision was about. So we get on a train from New York. We go across snowfields from New York all the way through Pennsylvania, through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, wherever, and across North Dakota and into Glendive, Montana. There, that was as close as the train would get us to Savage. And Glendive from Savage is maybe 100 miles away. So the family, our sponsors, the Seavees, Seeves, Robert and Ida Seavey, and their kids, Bobby Lou, Alice Gay, and Craig, met us, and into their car we piled. We didn't have much luggage. We had 2 little suitcases. One was made out of wood, and I still have that one down in the basement somewhere. And that was it. We had the clothes on our backs that we had, and headed for the farm. Lived there for 2 years with the Seavees. Dad was a farmhand. He milked cows, he plowed fields, he wrangled, and he fixed broken things. He was a great, great handyman.
Were those happy times for your family? I'm sure it was scary leaving family in your home, but do you remember that as happy times your first 2 years in America?
Well, it was secure times. And security translated to me back then as happy times, because I got to see my dad every day, and I got to hang out with my mom every day, and my aunt was there, but we had no other Greek people hanging around us. We would get packages from our relatives back in Greece once every 3 or 4 or 5 months, and it would be a can of Cipro that they smuggled. It would be like a olive oil can, and but these were the big olive oil cans with somebody would put a little pin-sized hole on the bottom of it, drain it of olive oil, fill it up. Somehow or another, they would fill it up with ouzo and seal it back up with a spot of solder and send it, over that in that fashion to us. My dad had a can of that shit with us on the train, and he would get one of the black guys who were porters. He would get him wasted every night. And the porter, in turn, would give me Babe Ruths and Hershey bars.
You said New York was like you might as well landed on another planet. What were some other cultural differences that you noticed as a boy early on making that move?
Well, I noticed how big America was, even though it didn't mean much to me. It took 2 or 3 days sitting on the train to go from New York to Montana, maybe longer, I don't remember. I'd never experienced snow. It was cold, and in Montana, yeah, it was definitely the middle of winter. The language barrier was, it separated us.
And
We
no one in your family spoke English at the time, right?
No,
Okay.
no. So we had to learn the language, and we were, in the beginning, especially in school, some of the people were rather critical and cruel.
Sure.
Of this family of strangers, because there were no other Greeks, I guarantee you, in Savage. Probably the nearest ones would have been in Billings or Bismarck or somewhere, but we ended up finding a colony of Greeks, a Greek community in Billings, and that's where we gravitated and moved to in 59. But, yeah, there were culturally, everything was different. I mean, unthinkably different, because there was, you can't make something out of nothing. And nothing is all I knew about America. Mm-hmm. And so everything that I encountered was brand new. And as such, it was strange, fascinating, and delightful.
What's your very first memory of being exposed to American music? Was it in Greece or before you got here, or was it when you got here?
Well, as I said, back in the old country, along with the Greek melodies that I would hear melodies that came out of, military bands. That melody stuck in my head from when I was in Greece, mm-hmm. because anyway, it was different, so there were other melodies as well that were foreign that I had heard, but I didn't know what they were. They weren't Greek, that's for sure. But my first influences of American music were probably from the radio stations that we could receive. There may have been a radio station in Sydney, which is 20 miles north of Savage. And Sydney was a town of maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people back then. It's not much bigger now, but there might be 10,000, 12,000 now. Maybe Williston, North Dakota had a radio station or two. But in any case, there were radios in the house. And people would turn on a radio station, my mom would, just to have background noise, while she was doing her work. And also the three kids that were upstairs. Craig was exactly my age. Bobby Lou was, if I was 7, she was 8 or 9. And to my 7, Alice Gay was 14 or 15 at that time. Alice Gay, being the teenager in the bunch upstairs, she was listening to teenage music from 1957-56. That would have been songs like Young Love, Gone by Ferlin Husky, Elvis Presley, all of his songs from that time period. Perry Como singing Catch a Falling Star and Put It in Your Pocket. K-Star singing Rock and Roll Waltz. It was just the songs of the late 50s, you know.
Would in Montana during the late 50s, or say 56, 57, would you hear black music there like Little Richard and Chuck Berry? Would that make it on the radio there? Were there any race record stations at all?
If Lucille was being played, it was the Pat Boone version.
Uh-huh. Well, that's what I was curious about. So y'all probably didn't get, say, like a Chicago radio station or...
No. We didn't. We weren't quite that in tune.
Yeah.
And I was just a single-digit kid, you know.
Yeah.
And I didn't know the differences of what was going on in the neighborhood back then.
Sure.
It took another 6 years up until I was 12, 13 before I knew who Chuck Berry was. And, you know, and he was probably the first black guy that I heard the music of. Him and Lloyd Price, mm-hmm. and whoever was singing at that time, the Platters. They were a black group from that same time period.
I can see where they would be considered more sophisticated, where you might have heard them. I was just curious about the times and geographically what you were getting there, you know.
I was getting the milk and white bread version of things.
Of rock and roll. But you were getting pure country. You were getting the country stuff straight up, right?
Straight up, and the rock and roll of that time period was just a degree or two of difference between the rock and the country.
Yeah, sure.
Because rock came out of country.
Yeah.
The very same people, the first ones that did rock and roll, were also doing country.
Yeah.
You know, so it was just an attitude in the beginning. Rock and roll was an attitude that separated the children from their parents. Rock and roll in the beginning was a way of flipping your dad off, you know, and your mom, because you didn't want to clean your room, you know. And so rock and roll means never to have to say you're sorry. That's what rock and roll is. It's an act of rebellion. So
really that music that the Rebetiko that you spoke of had some of the same elements as rock and roll.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I call it the Greek blues, Greek rock and roll. It came out of the same mindset. The only difference is the instrumentation. Mm-hmm. You know, the music that was coming out of Greece didn't get amplified till maybe the early 60s. In the 50s, every time you would get a band together, everything was acoustic. So you had a piano, you had maybe a drummer, but everything else in there, the violin and the oud and the bouzouki and the baglama, the accordion, all those instruments, they were just done acoustic in the room, and the singer would just stand up and face the crowd and sing.
Yeah.
And it was just, they didn't have PAs, they didn't have instruments. Well, the 60s brought all that into play, and so it went.
So you've told me before you were a shoeshine boy, and you sang to customers, I think.
Mm-hmm.
How old were you? And tell me about that.
Well, now, when we first arrived in Billings in 59, it would have been the spring of 59, summer, somewhere in there. And upon arriving there, we rented an apartment from an old Greek fella who had a couple of apartments adjacent to his home. His name was Pete Thodas, and he was an old immigrant who came to Montana back in the early 1900s when he left Greece and came to America and got a job working for the railroad, the Northern Pacific. So, and then he settled in Billings, along with the rest of the community of Greeks that were there, restaurant owners and people, business people, small business people. What was the question? I spaced it out.
Well, it was about you being a shoeshine boy and singing songs to customers. I wanted to ask how old you were and about the songs and just all of that.
Well, all right. So at 9, when we moved to Billings and lived there, the house where we rented was maybe 7 blocks away from downtown, 5, 6, 7 blocks away from where the Billings Gazette was. And that was the local newspaper at the time. There were 2 newspapers in Billings, the Gazette and the Yellowstone News. So it just came natural to me to go downtown every evening after school. So around 4:30, you were standing in line with a bunch of little white boys, little Mexican boys, and little black boys, and some Indian boys, and standing in line with about $1 in my pocket, and getting this fella named Carl who would give us whatever we wanted as far as newspapers, whatever we could afford. We'd pay 2.5 cents a paper and sell them for 5, so we were doubling our money. So for $1, you could buy, I don't know if it was 15 papers or whatever it was. Go out, sell those, and well, once I bought my papers and got in line, got my papers, made friends with, the kids that I was then friends with for the rest of my life, either friends or enemies, because a lot of those street kids were also my enemies. They would pick on me. Mm-hmm. I was always the foreigner, but they knew who I was, and I didn't back off, man. I stood my ground. I got in fucking fights every night of my life back there. And sometimes I'd get thumped, sometimes I'd do the thumping. But I wasn't afraid to take it on when it came. Anyway, I would take my handful of newspapers in my paper bag, and I also noticed at that time that there were shoe shiners in different locations on the streets, mostly in the pool hall. There was 3 or 4 of those guys. So I bought a shoe shine kit. I bought, your basic colors, black, brown, and neutral. And I got me some brushes and rags, and by God, I knew how to spit. And I would give you a shoe shine. Well, I would hit all the damn bars on Main Street, First Avenue, Minnesota Avenue, and so on, wherever all the bars were. I'd go in there, and there would be lonely men on bar stools drinking little glasses of red wine or beer. And I would go down the row, and I'd say, shoe shine, paper. And the fellow would say, yeah, but you got to sing a song. So I would sing a song for these people. And the song that I sang to them primarily back there was He's Got the Whole World in His Hands. And it just would have, I guess it warmed their hearts enough to where they would reach in and buy a newspaper, tip me a quarter, and then on I'd go to the next guy. So by the end of the day, when I'd get home, if I hit the streets after school, say I was in the 2nd grade in 59, I'd go downtown in the winter times after school, hit the streets selling my newspapers and shining shoes, walk back home that night maybe at around 8. Sometimes I'd be out till 11 or 12. Doing exactly that. Most of those nights were done in the summertime. And back in those days, your mom and dad didn't worry about their little son, who was only 10 or 11 years old at the most. They didn't worry. There was nothing to worry about. There wasn't the craziness back there that there is today. Anyway.
So let me ask you a couple of questions about that. Did you hear music in any of those bars?
Absolutely.
What were you hearing?
The jukeboxes, there were 2 forms of music in the bars, jukeboxes and bands. Bands played primarily on weekends, and they would play Friday nights, Saturday nights, and Sunday afternoons. So the bands would play on Sundays, maybe from 1 or 2 in the afternoon till 5 or 6 that night. And then they'd go home after that because they had to get ready for going to work on Monday, But all the women were in those layered petticoats that made the dresses look like they were just row upon row of this undergarment, that just made their dresses balloon out, sort of. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, so that was kind of some kind of western stuff going on there. Is that what that is?
It was, along with their boots. And the boys, they wore Levi's or black slacks, either shoes or boots, cowboy boots. Most of your cowboys here wore boots. Most of the people wore boots out here.
Yeah.
And the women wore boots as well, you know, and I would shine women's shoes too, you know. Boots were 50 cents because you had to do the tops as well as the bottoms.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So what kind of what you said there were bands and jukeboxes, and what kind of music were you hearing from the bands and the jukeboxes?
They were doing traditional country and Western music of the 50s, 40s, 50s, and early 60s up till that moment wherever I was.
Would you hear like Western swing too out there?
You would hear everything from Hank Thompson to Hank Snow to Ernest Tubb, Kitty Wells. You'd hear Wanda Jackson. You'd hear Ferlin Husky, Jim Reeves, Eddie Arnold. That was the pantheon of country artists from the 40s, 50s, and into the early 60s. Okay. They were all going strong. Yeah. They were all, during the summer times especially, the big name stars would travel in these cavalcades and would come into town, and they would print up posters that they would put up throughout the businesses, you know, Johnny Cash, June Carter, you know, the Jordanaires, you know, whoever the headliners were and who the other acts along with them. And, you know, then they would probably use one band, and then all these artists would get up and do their segment, and you'd see them at the Shrine Auditorium, at the Beacon Club, at the Armory, wherever there was enough room for a big crowd of 200 to 500 people, because that was a big crowd. Yeah. 200 was a big crowd. 500 was a big crowd. They would also come during the fair and entertain people during the fair, you know. So it was just the beginning of that booking enterprise.
Sure.
That would then, from those early days, will turn into William Morris and all the rest of the agencies that book all the different groups back then and still do, you know.
When you were in the bar shoeshine and then either hearing bands or jukebox, did you hear other music like polka music or any regional music, or were there other, you know, influences besides, say, country in those bars?
You bet. There was a solid, the same people that listen to Western music, country and Western music, also listen to polka music, would also listen to folk artists like Burl Ives and Jimmy Driftwood, who is a great writer. They would also listen to Jimmy Davis, who, I don't know, I thought he did This Old House, you know?
Yeah.
And
Governor Jimmy? No. What about like Woody Guthrie? I know that's a different era, but would that kind of stuff still resonate?
Woody Guthrie came a little bit later, so somewhere around 64, 65, I started hearing more the Guthrie influence.
Yeah.
Because he was more political in his, where he found a listening audience.
Yeah. Well,
go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, Woody Guthrie was in your junior high to high school days. They would have hootenannies on the weekends at the school at Eastern Montana College.
Mm-hmm.
and at Rocky Mountain College. And you would go there, and all these kids would play their Chad Mitchell Trio and the Kingston Trio, and, that's sort of the new Christy Minstrels. That's sort of,
So Guthrie got revived in the early 60s folk revival.
Yeah, he got picked up with This Land Is Your Land and all the rest of it.
All right, let me go back and ask you, before we move on, about these bars you shoe-shined in and sang. You said that you would go in there during the week and it would be mostly lonely men drinking wine or beer, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a shortage of ladies in Montana, or they just didn't at that time go to bars as much unless they had a date? Or I'm just curious about that.
The only time you'd see a woman in a bar was when she was going in to grab her man off the bar stool and take him home.
So this was ladylike.
Yeah. I'm serious. The weekends is when the women would come out.
Yeah.
They would come out in groups of 2 or 3, maybe 4. Mm-hmm. And the guys would probably be solo or with their buddy.
Yeah.
And so the girls, it was a promenade, They would strut their stuff in front of each other, and they'd ask each other to dance, and they'd buy each other drinks, and they'd get to know each other, and then they'd go home together or meet the next night or do whatever they were going to do.
Okay.
But during the weekdays, in most of the bars, it was lonely men with their head in a black cloud, sitting on a stool.
Now you said little glasses of wine or beer, and I always picture the West as guys drinking whiskey at the bar and all. Is that just kind of what's that about? I'm just curious.
Well, the deal is this: most of the guys in the bar, a glass of red wine. They weren't in those tumbler glasses. These were straight up, little narrow round, and maybe 5-inch tall glasses, And you would get your, I don't know if it was some rosé, like who are some of those Italian Rossi,
yeah.
Where you can buy a bottle or jug for $5 or $6.
Yeah, I got you.
It's table wine.
Yeah.
Well, that's basically what they had. That's where the winos were. You could afford a glass of wine for, I don't know if it was a dime, 20 cents, or a quarter.
Yeah.
And a beer was the same. Back in those days, if you should be lucky, you can find an 8-ounce glass for which the top of the glass kind of mushroomed out from its base, Mm-hmm. And sometimes the beer manufacturer's logo would be on glasses, so you'd have Lucky Lager or Olympia or Great Falls Select or Highlander or Sheridan beer, or these were local beers from around here, Hams, Grain Belt. All those were different, popular beers back in those days. And so for a quarter or 20 cents, you could buy a bottle of beer, and they would either have the short ones or the long necks. And And then for an added dime, you could get yourself a little can of tomato juice and get yourself, your vegetables while you were getting your alcohol.
Yeah. So let me ask you this about those times. I remember in your acceptance speech at the Hall of Fame that you mentioned that you grew up seeing Cowboys in Montana, and then you said real Cowboys.
Real, yeah.
And that tickled me because there's Ronnie Dunn with cowboy tattooed across his forearm, and Dwight Yoakam in his cowboy hat doing his cowboy thing and all that funny stuff. But tell me about growing up around real cowboys, because that's something I wouldn't know anything about.
Well, Montana is a rural state in the Northwest, and it was originally settled by ranchers, agrarians, farmers, foresters, or miners. All four camps are basic pillars to who Montanans are, if you're not a Native American.
Mm-hmm.
So Montana was at one time, cowboys ran the state. And cowboys then branched out and went into trucking businesses where they would, one time, you would have the Chisholm Trail or the Santa Fe or the Bozeman Trail and bring your herd of 10,000 of cows up here. Now you have semis, and so you got into the trucking business as well as the ranching business. Well, then, along with trucking businesses, you became an oil person, because if you were successful at being a cattleman, then you branched out because they found oil on your property or coal, so a lot of industrial people were also cowboys up here. People that branched out into other fields besides ranching. They were still cowboys at heart, and all the businesses they got into ran through each other. They were part of what made that particular business work. Ranchers up here in Montana, the cowboys, the ranches are, there's ranches up here that are 250-mile square, big enough to fit Maryland or Delaware into one ranch. So within that ranch, you'd have, 15 or 20 cowboys working as hands, taking care of this section or that section of the ranch. And anyway, so the state Billings in particular was a hub for transporting cattle and sheep. So it would bring livestock in, it would bring livestock out of the state to go to market. Chicago, Oklahoma, wherever, Texas, Colorado. And so it became a place where cowboys would bring their cows to market. There was a feedlot, and Livestock Commission was in Billings. The fairgrounds was all about cattle and sheep and and farm animals and all that sort of stuff. There's just a degree of separation between a rancher and a farmer. They both lead similar, if not the same, life. So that's what Billings was full of. Even the truck drivers wore boots. And maybe during, the months of May through August, the guy got laid off on the ranch, so he took a job in town as a truck driver. Then later on, he got on a farm and was working, doing something related to the farming side of things. But it was all about being rural country and white. And I don't mean that in any negative way. It's just the way it was.
Yeah,
Montana was absolutely as white as white can get, with the exception of the Crow, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Cree tribes, the Blackfoot. So you had that element. You also had a Mexican element. So if Billings back in 1959 or 60 might have been 25,000 people. Of that 25,000 people, 4,000 might have been Mexicans.
And did you hear any music from the Mexicans as a kid? I
did, because I was friends with a cat named Chan Romero. And in 1969, I think, or 59 or 60, right around there, the first wave of rock and rollers were Elvis and Johnny Burnett and all the Cochran and whoever else was on that train. Carl Perkins and what was that Pretty Woman? Who am I thinking of?
Pretty Woman, rock and roll. You said Wanda Jackson already. Laurie Collins?
No. Well, the Collins kids were part of that. No, he did Pretty Woman. Who am I thinking of?
Roy Orbison.
Roy Orbison, yeah. So all that the class of 56, I think, is what they were known as. After them, in the mid-50s, you started to see black labels appearing. Chess, Specialty, Jewel, and other small labels that would release, artists like Lloyd Price, Little Richard, Fats Domino on Imperial. And so you got to hear those cats coming through the airwaves in the late 60s. Or not late 50s. So say from about 56, 57, 58, with the advent of every latter year in the 50s, more black artists were being heard by white America, even in Montana. So one of the most popular black artists back then was Little Richard. And whatever that guy came out with, some white cat would go out and cut a white version of it. And it sucked. But they still got rich doing it. That would be your Pat Boones, Little Richard was coming up with these songs like Lucille. Well, when Little Richard did it, he rocked the fucking thing up lit the fuse, and off it went into the solar system. Along come the best white version of Lucille to come around was done by the Everly Brothers.
Yeah.
Their version of Lucille was prettier than Little Richard's because of the production and also their voices. And one of my favorite licks of all time is in the solo of that, and I think, what's his name? Chet Atkins was playing the guitar. But it's just a lilt on a guitar. Right there.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it stays with you. You know, if you, we dissect these things and look into them and love them.
Sure.
Anyway.
Well, let me go back and ask you, though. You mentioned the Mexican population in Montana.
Yeah.
And started to tell me about what music you heard as a boy from that group of people there in your
Okay. Well, all right. So I was telling you, here's the connection. Little Richard comes out with Lucille in the late 50s on Specialty Records. A young Mexican kid in Billings by the name of Chan Romero hears the song and is inspired because Chan was a great and is a great musician. He's a great songwriter. He's a great guitar player. He plays the blues, Mexican-style blues, but he feels the shit because he's a natural, you know. So Chan, upon being influenced by, I'm thinking, his hero of the time, or heroes, he grows up on the south side of town. That's the poor side of Billings. That's across the tracks. That's where all the Mexicans and blacks and trailer whites live, you know?
Yeah.
And so they're relegated to live on that side of town, and all the rest of, you know, Billings lived on the other side of the tracks. And so the white kids from the goody side of town would go to the south side and hang out with the Mexicans, the blacks, and the poor whites, and party with them because they partied a lot better than we did because they were not as regulated as we were by rules and by laws. And so they snuck in weed, whites, and wine and mixed it all up together. Their jukeboxes were full of soul music and the ripping rock and shit that was being put out by every other color of people besides the whites. Their food was soul food, you know, and they all lived under the radar because that's where the hookers were. That's where the pimps were. That's where the kids that wanted to be rockers would go and hang out and listen to the jukeboxes in those joints. So Chan Romero grew up on the south side. He was a poor Mexican kid in a white town. But he was born to be connected to the music. And his influences were the black music and the Mexican music that was coming out at that time. So at that time, music by Mexicans, that would be Richie Valens primarily. And there might have been a couple of other Mexican artists that were starting to make noise back there. In any case, Chan's hero was Little Richard, and he patterned and wrote this song called The Hippa Hippa Shake. And it's patterned, if you listen to it and listen to Lucille and study the way the two songs are constructed, you'll see where Chan is basically rewriting Lucille. But
wow, and I was just looking at him online and seeing that, you know, I know the Swing and Blue Jeans version and the Georgia Satellites version and the Beatles live version in the Cavern Club. So you knew him as a teenager?
I did, yeah.
So he was a big influence on you then, I would say, songwriter. I mean, you knew somebody that could actually do it.
Well, not only that, but I recorded a 45 in 1966 on his label, and anytime he would put out a new 45, it was nothing to create your own label. So it came out, my 45 produced by him was on his label called Warrior Records. Mm-hmm. And the song, one side of it was called Jane. I wrote that song. And there really wasn't much to it at all. It was garbled up nonsense from the onset, except that it also revealed that I was intrigued with melody.
Every evening as I dream about you can never tell what's running across my mind. By the sun's own light, I will see you as your face will shine. And your name keeps rolling across my mind. I remember as I touched your face, and I held your warm embrace, and your name keeps rolling across my mind. Why must you play such tricks on my mind? Don't you know that love like this is hard to find? Wander home through the wind and remember the things you did, and my mind keeps rolling all the time. Long brown hair in your eyes as the sun goes flying by, and your name keeps running through my mind. I wonder, should I come or is it too late? And if I do, will it be worth the wait? When the moon is shining bright, I will see you as your face will shine, and your name keeps rolling across my mind. I remember as I touched your face, and I held your warm embrace, and your name keeps rolling.
You might be able to find that online under my name.
Okay.
and you might be able to hear that particular rendering. So in any case, I did a 45 with him when I was a junior in high school. And, yeah, that was interesting. I was selling 45s out of my locker like you wouldn't believe, man.
And then was Jane before Something We Call Love?
They were both at the same time.
You know I've got a girl, my bride soon to be. We love each other so, and this has got to be. We've got something we call love. I hear them talk of love, they say there's not enough. Hate is in the way they say, that's why there's little love. But we've got something we call love.
I never knew that about that influence on you there in your hometown. That's huge, man.
Oh, well.
Don't you think that, I mean, you knew somebody that could write a song that would get recorded by other people? Or?
Well, the fact is, when I think about it today, as to what I was thinking back in that time period, Chan became an instant star at that point in time, not on the basis of the other groups that recorded his song. They came after. Chan had a regional minor hit. It was more than regional. It was, Pan-American. It went from one coast to the other. But it was a small hit. But it was one of those things that got shipped over to the European continent as records would weekly go. Whatever new current singles were coming out of the States were being shipped over to England and Germany, and the kids over there were picking up on it and thinking it was cool. And the bands over there, like the Beatles, who were first starting out and playing in Hamburg, and did a cover of the Hippa Hippa Shake. And so that began the process by which Chan lived for the next 40 or 50 years and still does off the royalties of that one song. He never had any other big hits after that. He had his deal with United, but was that the label I told you he was on?
Well, he was on. He owned Warrior. You didn't tell me what label he was on, though.
Well, in whatever year it was, 60 or 61, he came out with the Hippa Hippa Shake, and he pretty much based his song off of in my opinion, off of Little Richard. Okay. At that same point in time, Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, the Big Bopper, that airplane ride that they took, that happened at about a year before Chan, or somewhere in that same period of time. You'll have to go back and see when those cats got killed.
It looks here like he put out Hippie Hippie Shake in 59 on Columbia, so it should have been around the same, all kind of happened there at the same time.
Exactly. So, with Richie Valens no longer being around, he was dead. They had to find a new Richie Valens, and when Chan came out with that song, the record moguls knew that there were as many, in the country, they were trying to direct songs to each camp of people that existed. There were Mexican kids that wanted to hear more Mexican kids and their rock and roll.
Sure.
And Chan was the next big Mexican artist after Richie Valens with his song, The Hippie Hippie Shake, which was a regional hit, and then it died, and then Chan's career disappeared as well. He came back to Billings, and in 64, 65, and prior to maybe 63, 62, I was shining shoes and selling papers, and that's how I got to know him. He heard me singing. He's got the whole world in his hands somewhere on the south side. And, he befriended me, and he was a little older than I, and so I started hanging out with him to whatever extent, and was influenced by him not necessarily by any direct influence.
Right.
It was more that he was one of the neighborhood kids, and he did what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. I was the only thing we had in common was I had the desire to he having the ability. He had the ability because he was older and he'd been at it longer, so he knew how to play the guitar better than I did. He understood music better than I did, but we both had a love and a hunger for this thing. And, I worked with him on that little record that we put out back there. And so Chan was an influence, but he didn't influence me in my style.
Right.
And what I did.
I'm just saying, though, to be in a small town and actually know somebody that could write a song that would get some notoriety, or somebody that had been to L.A., that'd be a window to look through.
When he went to L.A., he lived with Richie Valens' wife and mother.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
They adopted him because they thought, they were heartbroken, number one. And to find this young Mexican kid that did what their son did or their husband did. We were all into rock and roll, and, we were just crazy young kids setting out to be, everything we saw in rock and roll that we wanted to be,
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah. Before rockers had long hair, they had that Baptist hairdo that Elvis,
Sure.
that cone, that unicorn that comes out, that black shiny unicorn that would come out 7, 8, 9, 10 inches, as far out as you could get it in front of you,
That's funny. Is Chan still in Billings? Yeah.
I think he goes there at times,
Mm-hmm.
and other times I think he's in California. He turned into a Pentecostal preacher kind of guy, and and he talks like this. Hey, Kostas, I'm telling you, you got to come to church, man. Jesus is going to save you. You're running with the devil.
Oh, that's funny. I just looked up a thing where it says he lives in Palm Springs, but it looks here like back in around 2014, McCartney was coming through Montana to play, and Chan was trying to hook up and do the hippie shake with him.
Yeah, and I think McCarthy, he didn't have time for that. I don't know that they hooked up, but.
Well, it's cool. He wrote a song that, I mean, you know what I'm saying. Like, if he never did anything else, that's pretty cool.
Absolutely, because that one particular song, first of all, it was a hit for Chan.
Mm-hmm.
Then along comes the Swingin' Blue Jeans and recorded it in 1964, I think.
Yep.
And then whoever you mentioned, some spandex
rock. The Atlanta, Georgia rock and roll band, the Georgia Satellites, did it on the soundtrack of Cocktail, which was a huge Tom Cruise movie in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would say that when the Beatles anthology came out in the late 90s,
mm-hmm.
their Star Club version was on that, which he probably scored big time. That anthology sold really well.
Exactly.
And I had a Star Club record when I was like 19. There was, and I'm sure those were bootlegs. I don't know, but there were vinyl records of the Beatles playing the Star Club years ago. I don't know if they were bootlegs or not, but I bet the anthology paid well.
Oh, I'm sure. But off of that one song, Chan lived from 1959 through the current year, whatever amount of years it's been.
Mm-hmm.
59, 69, 79, 89, 99, that's 50. 09 is 60, and 19 is 71 years.
Yeah.
Or is it 61?
I don't know, but that's a copyright, man.
Oh, my
pretty
God.
Awesome.
One song, has, and Chan, he still goes to England and Europe and Australia and does their summer tours, the cavalcades that Alan Freed shit that used to, the Shirelles and Bobby V and all the rest of it.
Sure.
They get together and, do their wang dang doodle.
This is a lot of fun, Kostas. For me.
It is for me too.
I'm going to save these recordings. This is really cool, man. I appreciate you just hanging and visiting with me about all this. Like, there's a lot here I didn't know, and some I did, and it's really cool.
Well, Odie, I appreciate somebody wanting to delve into what I recall of it all, but I appreciate it too, there isn't much left to do in life except to just keep on living one day at a time, but having your memoirs, taking a look at them is a lot of fun. It just, especially with you, because you understand the nuances and the lenses that we're looking through. And because you love the music, I know you do, and I appreciate the music that's in you. You are one of the last of the real songwriters that there is around today, that is influenced by the old school stuff,